Hello and welcome to another lecture video in invertebrate paleontology and paleobotany at Utah State University. In this lecture, we'll examine the evolution and origin of the first seed plants, the Gymnosperms. The term Gymnosperm is derived from the Greek root gym, or gymnio, which means naked. This is the same root that we get gymnastics and gymnasium, and the reason for that is that the Greeks used to perform sporting events naked. So think about that next time you watch gymnastics. Now, sperm, of course, is in reference to seeds in plants. Now, the reason that they're called naked seed plants is because the ovules, and these are going to be where the eggs are exposed at the time of fertilization rather than being enclosed by carpels. Now, ovules are the part of the plant that gets fertilized by pollen and then which ripen into the seeds that we'll see. Now, gymnosperms do not form fruits. And we'll talk about the sporangia that are produced and restricted to cone-like structures. And these, of course, are called the strombula or strombulus in the singular. All right, now we can group these more advanced seed plants into a single monophyletic group of plants, which include the cycads, the ginkgos, the conifers, the gynophytes, and the angiosperms. Hence, the gymnosperms are a polyphyletic group, likely ancestral to the angiosperms. And gymnosperms include many of the evergreen trees, such as conifers and junipers, but they also include a few deciduous trees like ginkgos. All right, so the origin of seed plants from spore-bearing plants was a really big innovation in the evolution of Earth's flora. Now here we have the typical life cycle of a fern. Now remember that ferns produce spores. These spores fall to the ground and grow into this gametophyte generation. These are tiny little plants that sole function is in the sexual reproduction of the plant. Now the gametophyte contains both male and female parts, with the male parts being the antherium and producing the flagellated sperm, which swim in the water to reach the archegodium, which contains the eggs. And then once fertilized, these eggs grow into a zygote, and eventually into a new fern plant. So sexual reproduction occurs in the water, and hence ferns have a limited habitat for wet environments, or at least seasonally wet environments. Now the evolution of a mechanism to just forego this whole requirement of sexual reproduction in the water would be a major advantage, as this would allow plants to become fully independent of these wet climates. All right, so let's go through the steps towards developing seeds that we'd have to go through. All right, so the first step, step one, is a decrease in the number of spores in some of the sporangia. These are followed by step two, which is an increase in the size of the remaining spores. So plants would have bigger and fewer spores. Now the third step would be that these spores would have a consistent number and be of a larger size on the plant. And then the fourth step would involve the change from monoecious gametophytes, those are gametophytes with both sex organs, and that's what you see in a lot of ferns, to a deciduous, those are gametophytes that have either male or female parts. Now we've seen this in some of the bryophytes, where the gametophytes were in separate sexes, but this is going to be in some of these bigger plants. And finally, the last step, and this is the biggest step, and this is when the gametophytes actually develop on the plant rather than being shed off of the plant. This means that the gametophyte generation is retrained on the sporophyte generation. So this is a major reversal of roles between the two generations of a plant's life cycle. Thus, the gametophyte becomes the important part of the above ground plant, and we'll look for this transition in the fossil record and attempt to see how seeds originated in plants following these steps. All right, so this is a major switch from the fern life cycle. That is that we're going to have the retention of the gametophytes, these parts of the life cycle, on the actual plant itself, on the sporophyte generation. Now, these gametophytes are going to look and they're going to act very differently than what we see in ferns. All right, so what then is pollen if it's not a spore is it the sperm. So instead of having flagellated sperm that require water to swim, seed plants protect the sperm within the male gametophyte. So a male gametophyte is pollen. Yep, the entire thing is pollen. That's really weird. So the sperm cells, or sperm nuclei, are protected by other cells within the pollen, which help move the pollen through the air so that it can be deposited into the ovula and the female gametophyte generation, which contains the egg cell. All right, so to reinforce this idea, pollen is the male gametophyte. That's pretty cool. All right, so let's look at some of these structures on a modern conifer. So we have male and female cones on the plant. Now the male cones produce the sporangia that hold on to the spores, which actually develop into pollen sacs that contain thousands of tiny pollen. Now this is a cross-section down here of a typical cone and showing each of these pollen sacs that are inside. So these will, when the plant dries in the height of summer, they'll split open and burst and release millions and trillions of pollen, and these pollens are the gametophyte generation being sent out into the air. Now pollen look like, here's some pictures of the pollen down here, and they kind of look like little Mickey Mouse. They have little ears, little Mickey Mouses, because they have little ears on either side, so two little ears on either side. And these are actually air bags or aura bladders, and they actually help the pollen be dispersed in the air. All right, here is a microscopic view of a pine pollen. And note that in addition to these little Mickey Mouse ears that you see with a lot of conifer pollen in particular, you also see these tube that comes out here, this long tube. And that long tube is called the pollen tube. And this tube is going to be important when the pollen comes and actually fertilizes the egg that's in the ovula in the female cones of the plants. All right, so now let's take a look at the life cycle of a typical gymnosperm, like a pine tree. And it's very different. So the male and female cones on the plant retain the gametophyte generation, at least. And the female cones contain what are called the Megasporangia. So these are spores that are going to be very big. And those spores, those bigger spores, are going to grow into the female gametophytes with an archaeopteryx that contains an egg cell. The male cones contain what are called the microsporangium, so tiny little spores, and those tiny spores are going to grow into the male gametophytes. Those male gametophytes are the same thing as pollen. And then the pollen is released in massive quantities into the air. They float around, and then they happen to fall onto the female cone, and the female cone is then fertilized to form a zygote encased in a seed. And then the seed is shed, and that seed then can grow into a new plant. So this is kind of like what we see with a lot of these seed plants that you're probably more familiar with. All right, so now let's look at the hypothesized sort of evolution of seed plants. So in the first stage here, we have a sporangium that's referred to as homosporous. So all the spores in the sporangium look the same, even though some of them would develop into female or male plants, or into plants that have both female and male parts on them. And then we have to move to the next stage here. And the next stage here is a stage where we have two different types of spores on the plant. So we have spores that are microspores and megaspores. So the megaspores would be the ones that are going to be the female spores, and the microspores are going to be the ones that develop into the pollen eventually. And then we go to the next step here, where that megaspore gets reduced, and it retains itself on the plant so that it grows into a gametophyte. And this means that then the egg then is encased in the archaeopteryx of the gametophyte that's held onto the plant. And we refer to that as endospory. And then eventually we get this very important stage where we get the megaspore gets encased by sort of like a cup-like structure that's called the ovum, and that's going to be where the female gametophyte resides, and that cup-like shape is going to be what's going to catch the pollen that's blown out to the wind. Okay, here is a thin section through one of these female gametophytes, and here we see a really greatly reduced archegodium within the ovula, and it has an egg cell. This is the nucleus cell that's going to be the egg, and we see a pollen chamber right here. This is where the pollen will come down and grow and then invaginate into the nucleus of the egg for fertilization. Now, the other thing to remember is that once this egg cell in the female gametophyte is fertilized, it will form into a seed rather than a plant. So seeds are a pretty novel innovation, and as we'll see, will have a profound effect on the flora and fauna of the world. And this is a major innovation to really get away from wet climates and a wet environment. So by doing this, these plants are really becoming fully terrestrial and start to take over some of these drier climates and get out away from these very wet, dense areas. Now, many of these transitions are preserved in the fossil record in a group of fossil plants called the ProtoGymnosperms. Now, these plants are the ancestors of the modern Gymnosperms and show the acquisition of many of these traits. Now, ProtoGymnosperms are all extinct, but their fossil record extends all the way back to the Devonian. Now, the ProtoGymnosperms, way down here, really split off very early in the evolution of plants. And throughout the Carboniferous, they also split into various groups of plants we'll talk a little bit about. By the end of the Carboniferous, the major groups of Gymnosperms have split and will all go on to become very successful. These include the conifers, the cycads, the ginkgos, and some really unusual groups that we're going to discuss later. All right, we want to look for some evidence among these Proto-Gymnosperms of things that we've mentioned before. We're going to look for Megaspores, so spores that are much bigger than we've seen before. We're going to see for endosporic gametophytes. These are going to be where the gametophytes are retained on the plant. We're also going to look for deciduous gametophytes. All right, so here we are. We're going to cross our fingers, and here's hoping that there's some really complete fossils to see if we can see some of these transitional features. All right, here's the first fossil plant we're going to look at. This is a Devonian plant. This is a Neurophyton. Now, a Neurophyton is believed to be a tree-like plant. It got kind of big, and it grew, and it has split-like sporangia. So these little structures down here that you see in this fossil, these are the sporangia. So they're kind of split-like to let out spores. Now, all the spores look the same on these plants. There doesn't appear to be male or female sporangia, and the spores are all pretty small. So we're not really seeing a plant that has the Megasporia condition that we saw in those early steps. Now, what makes a Neurophyton really interesting is that it contains Gymnosperm-like wood. The protostele is surrounded by secondary xylem composed of trichids and ray cells that come out. This is unique and allowed a Neurophyton to grow rather high like a tree during the late Devonian, very early in the history of plants. The next fossil is the tree-like Archaeopteryx, which was for many years recognized by fern-like leaves and often regarded as an early fern. Now, the leaves are very similar to modern ferns, with each leaf extending from a branch, like you can see in this fossil down here. They're very common fossils, actually. And many early paleobotanists regarded these as early ferns from the late Devonian and were, remarkably common fossils. Now, like ferns, Archaeopteryx produced free spores from the sporangia along the leaves. These are these little structures right down in here. You can see these are the sporangia that produce spores. And you can divide the leaves into sort of fertile leaves. These are the leaves with the spores, and the infertile leaves, the leaves without spores. And they're kind of arranged in an interesting sort of spiral pattern on these leaves. Now, a major discovery was made when the oldest fossil wood placed in the wood form taxa called Callisallin was discovered in association with the leaf-formed taxa Archaeopteryx. Hence, Archaeopteryx had gymnosperm-like wood, much like a neurophyton. And this was a pretty radical idea, that here we had this fern-like plant with fern-like leaves that also had gymnosperm woody-like xylem in the trunks of these trees. And this tree is pretty interesting because we're still in the late Devonian, so this is like the earliest, one of the earliest really true trees, big trees that we're starting to see on the planet. And here we are, way back in the late Devonian. All right, here's another fossil of Archaeopteryx, and whoa, what is this thing? Right down here. Wait. Oh my gosh, it's a different looking sporangia on a fossil branch. Wow. Some forms of Archaeopteryx have two types of sporangia, hence they're heterospory. That means that they have female and male sporangia on the plant. Now, these are megaspores, and these are larger female sporangia. This is really cool. So far, scientists have found there's actually two species of Archaeopteryx with different sex sporangia, just kind of like what we predicted, and we still are way back in the Devonian. All right, next we're going to head into the Carboniferous with a fossil called Lyngenuptrous, which is commonly found in coal balls. Now, this is a vine-like plant, and it has bifurcating leaves, and the plant has microsporangia that produce trilent pre-pollen. Now, trilent means that the pollen is of a tetrahad of cells. You can see that here in this figure down here labeled D from the textbook. And the plant also has an ovule. So here's the ovule. This is pretty cool. So here we have, this is the gametophyte, the female gametophyte, which here they've labeled as the Megaspores with the archegodium there. And so that's going to have the cell that's going to represent the egg cell. And it's in this really interesting cupula. So it's retaining this structure on the plant. So the gametophyte is on the plant and it's opened up, and we have this narrow column on the top that's going to catch those little pollen grains when they're released from the plant. Now, what's really interesting is that these ovules, when they're fertilized, will produce real seeds. So here is a picture of one of the earliest seeds we have. This is the form taxa, the seed form taxa for Lyngenuptrous, which is called Lyngenostoma. And this is the seed name for these structures found in these plants. But this is what the first seeds kind of look like. We have seeds! Now, the next fossil plant we're going to look at is Medulosa, which is a plant from the Mississippian or Lower Carboniferous. Now, it has an interesting woody structure. It has these secondary and primary xylem that grows in sort of an endocentric pattern. Now, this growth kind of resembles what we're going to see in cycads. Now, the leaf pattern resembles what we see in ferns. They have these alternating patterns, very similar to ferns. So if you found one of these leaves, you'd probably think that it's actually fern. Now, on these plants, we have these interesting male cones. So these are the male cones that are going to produce what we refer to as pre-pollen, or probably pollen, that come out of these. Now, the pollen that comes out of these are myelet pollen. That means that they're just round with a single pollen grain. Now, there's also known from this plant some ovules, and they also have that cupula, that cup-like shape. And those represent then the female cones, which then bore primitive seeds. So Medulosa is a primitive seed plant known from the early Carboniferous. Medulosa and other similar primitive gymnosperm-like plants are placed in a poorly defined group called the seed ferns, or Toritos. The reason for this is that these extinct plants are really difficult to place among the various modern gymnosperm groups today. So the Toritos are a paraphyletic group. They were likely ancestral to all later spermatophytes. Thanks for watching another lecture video. If you're interested in taking a class at USU, check out geology.usu.edu. And if you're interested in my research, stop by my webpage at benjamin-berg.org. Thanks again for watching.